Hey gang, it's Ruben. Welcome back to my channel. So we're back in the Chatting With series, and I am very excited to talk about my current guest, Sy Garte. And just a little bit about Sy real briefly. Sy is a PhD in biochemistry. He's been a tenured professor at New York University, Rutgers University, and the University of Pittsburgh. Crazy mad resume. He's also a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation, serves as vice president for the Washington, D.C. Metro chapter of the ASA. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the channel, Sy. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. And so one of the really amazing things that had me reach out to you is that you have your own journey from professional scientist, what kind of classically stereotype is the skeptic, non-believer, but then obviously something happened in your life that had you come to Christ. So feel free to tell us a little bit about your journey in your walk as becoming a Christian.
Yeah, well, you're right that a lot of scientists are skeptics about God, and so was I as a scientist. But my origin is actually my origin as an atheist. Didn't really have to do with science. It had to do with how I was brought up. My family were all atheists. They were very strong and militant atheists, and they were not only people who said they didn't believe in God. They believed that there could not be any such thing as God. They thought Christianity was one of the worst evils in the world and world history. They were about as militant atheists as you could find today, and this was a long time ago. So that's how I grew up. I grew up in an atmosphere of complete denial of anything related to religion, spirituality of any kind. No holidays were celebrated in my house, no religious holidays, just New Year's. And I never considered the idea that there might be a God of any kind. I just thought it was complete nonsense. And I did go into science. My father was a chemist, and I started studying chemistry in college. I learned a little physics during that time, a little bit about quantum mechanics, which you have to know as a chemist. And then in graduate school, I decided to go into biochemistry because I was always fascinated by life. And I got a PhD and then began a career in research, which I did for the next 30 years or so. Now, my journey to faith was started actually because of my science background. And I talk about that in the book, which we'll discuss later. And that is, I was learning things in science that didn't jive with what I'd been taught about the reality of materialistic atheism. In other words, learning about quantum physics really shook me up because, it didn't make a lot of intuitive, rational sense that so many things were based on pure chance. And that, the observer has an effect on what is real. The uncertainty principle. There were so many things in quantum physics that just seemed like crazy, from the point of view of a super rational materialist like me. So that made me think, well, maybe that view is not completely accurate. Maybe there actually is something else besides, pure math and pure physics and pure science. And I wasn't really sure. I certainly didn't believe in God, but I became a little bit more agnostic, I would say, than pure atheist. And it was a very slow journey. I would say sometime in my 40s, I actually was brought to church the first time ever in my life. I'd never been in a church before. And I was pleasantly surprised. I liked what I saw and heard, and I went back a couple of times. I actually started looking at the Gospels just out of curiosity. And again, I was very pleasantly surprised. I thought it would be all, silly nonsense that made no sense at all. And I thought it would all look like lies and propaganda. But in fact, especially the book of Acts, really convinced me that it sounded to me like I was reading a historical discussion of what really happened. And I read the Gospels as well, and the rest of the New Testament eventually. All that was very interesting, but what really had the effect on me, because it was very hard for me to intellectually come to faith. I understood at this point that there was something very interesting here about the person of Jesus Christ. I felt that if it was true that he had risen on the third day, that Christianity may be true, but I didn't have any evidence for that at that time. And, it was interesting. I liked it, but I wasn't going to be convinced by any of these arguments because I had so much resistance from my early, training in childhood. But what happened was I had a couple of dreams that were very powerful that featured Jesus Christ, the person of Jesus. I didn't know at the time that's who it was just a man. But they had a big effect on me. I didn't know what they meant. And I had some other experiences that I realized earlier in my life, even as a teenager. I had some experiences that seemed to, at the time, it seemed to really rock me and make me wonder what's going on. Is this all real? And I denied it. I put it out of my mind. I said it was just a trick of emotions and nothing that was real. But after I had these dreams, there were 2 or 3 of them, separated by a year or so each. But then I started thinking back about these other experiences, and finally, I was getting more and more into the idea of Christianity, of worshiping Jesus, but I still couldn't really get there. I couldn't believe it completely until I had one experience where it was so powerful. I was awake. I was driving in my car, and I talk about it in detail in the book, and I can discuss it a little, any of this later if you want. But this experience was so dramatic that I pulled over and I said out loud, I believe. And I did. And I've never gone back from then. And that happened in my late 50s, so about 15 years ago. And starting from that time, I felt such a transformative sense of joy and understanding and relief that I knew I would never go back. And I attribute that to the work of the Holy Spirit directly on my life. And you've probably heard many people say this kind of thing. I mean, it's a lot of conversion stories are involved with the direct interaction of the Spirit in people's lives, and this was one of them. I didn't expect it. But I remained a scientist, and I didn't tell many people about this because it's not very, how do I put it? It's not very looked well upon to start talking about Christian faith in the middle of a science academic group of people. So I kept it kind of quiet to myself. And eventually I ended up going to churches, and I got baptized about 8 years ago, finally. And then when I retired, I devoted the rest of my life to spreading the word of Christ through writing, speaking, whatever I can do. And my main target, my main goal is to convince people, especially young people, that there is no contradiction between science and Christian faith, that you can be a scientist and a very good Christian. You don't have to choose one or the other, as many people are told when they get to college. And that's a lie that should be resisted. And that's my main goal, is to try to convince folks that it's not an either or. Science actually comes from Christianity, and there's a very close connection between the two. So I'll stop there for now.
Wow. Amen. Thank you for sharing that. And, you reminded me real briefly about, uh, just how amazing that feeling is when you're just
Yeah,
filled by the Holy Spirit. I will always remember when I first accepted Jesus, and just is one of the most indescribable, powerful experiences.
right.
Just kind of, words just don't do it justice. So I was kind of feeling you when you were in that moment. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Uh, and on kind of that subject of science denial, so to speak, it actually does make me sad when there are those who are believers that feel threatened by science. And I've always kind of looked at it in the sense of, from my own experience first. And for me, you know, God is more real to me than anything else that I know. And like whatever science has to say about the world, reality, the universe, etc., it's nothing is going to shake my belief and knownness of God for me. And when I hear people kind of touch on that in a science seems threatening to my belief system kind of way, then it makes me sad, because I'm like, wow, then how strong and are you in your own faith? And it's just a little bit sad that
Right.
not everybody gets to experience the kind of conviction that you and I can seemingly relate to right now.
Right.
And so to extend that a little bit, though, there's definitely, I think, a fair criticism by skeptics who kind of come from that angle, because maybe they've been around, uh, let's just call them superficial Christians in that context, and use it as a disservice to kind of stereotype that all Christians must have, weak foundations, so to speak.
Mhm.
But one thing that I've also observed in reading testimony from other intellectuals, like, for example, I had a really cool book that I'm reading called Finding God at Harvard, and it's about a lot of different people explaining their kind of common experience of what the Harvard life is like, and how their journey to coming to faith was met in that type of circle. And one thing that I found quite interesting is quite a few of the testimonies seems to have this common denominator, that there almost seems to be like this, what I would call this reverse threat, like discussion of supernatural spirituality, creationism, et cetera, has become like completely and totally shut down in the world of higher education and academia. And I was
Right.
curious to get your thoughts on that, on what you may have experienced in this regard, not just in academia, one, but two, maybe specifically in the scientific community.
Right. Yeah, that's unfortunately, I think, is true, and it's getting more true with time. I think that with the rise of new atheism, the books by Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris and all those folks, which were very aggressive books, and they said that basically people who are atheists should actually not be quiet about it. They should go out and attack some people who have Christian faith, and get them to realize that they're wrong, because it's not scientific or whatever. And that caused a lot of problems. It still does. It causes a lot of problems in the academic world. And now I left academia in 2009, sort of at the height of this new atheist thing. I went to work at the NIH, which is a branch of the government, and I stayed there till I retired 6 years ago. So from 2009, I was out of academia. But you're absolutely right that I never had a conversation about anyone on matters of faith or spirituality ever. Now, it turns out that some of my friends in academia were actually religious, but I didn't know it because it was never talked about. It was never discussed. And even at NIH, which is sort of like an academic environment to an extent, when I retired, I was asked, there was a little get together for me, and I was asked to give a talk. And somebody asked me, what am I going to do now that I'm retiring? And I said, well, I'm going to do a lot of work at my church. And everybody's mouth dropped open. Nobody knew that I was religious. Nobody knew I was a Christian. And afterwards, 3 or 4 people came up to me and said, oh, that's so great. I'm a Christian too. And I had never known that either. So what it is I never experienced any actual negativity or harassment or anything like that, although I've heard other people who have. But what I did experience was a complete uneasiness with the whole subject of God, Christ, religion. And, it's in the whole society now. I mean, we're living in a, I mean, it's different in different parts of the country, but I'm in the Northeast right now. I've been living outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland for about a decade or so. And, in the whole Northeast, which is not terribly Christian, for example, as it would be in Texas or other parts of the country, it's kind of considered rude to to mention that you're a Christian and you want people to think about believing. So it's a cultural phase we're in right now. I think it's going to end at some point, and part of that is this concept that if you profess faith in Jesus Christ, well, then you must not be, you can't possibly be a scientist. And when I tweet, oh God,
You feel like people in the science community are afraid to tell their peers that they're believers, if that's the case?
It might be fear. It might just be not wanting to be uncomfortable. Because I mean, I remember telling one of my close friends that I was a Christian. I've known this woman for, I don't know, a long time, and we're very good friends. And she was quiet, and then she said something like, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Yeah." And now she's fine, and then she was fine with it. But there are people who are worried about what the reaction is going to be, because there's really a sense of prejudice against Christians, and I hate to say that, but if you go to a lot of faculty meetings and student meetings in some campuses now, and say you're Christian, you may get thrown out. you may get yelled at, or at least ignored. Now, I think this is a temporary thing. I think it's happened before, but it's disturbing to me. And I have this urge to spread, what I have learned as the truth. And it's okay now because I'm retired and I do most of it online. But as I was trying to say, when I tweet something about science, and I'll tweet something about science and how it's consistent with Christianity, I'll get hundreds, literally hundreds of replies from atheists, most of whom I've never heard of. They just drop by and say something really nasty. And it goes on and on. And this is not just me.
Trolling on the internet is a real thing.
Oh, it's a real thing. And, it's true for all. I know one or two other PhD scientists who are Christians and who are active on Twitter, and they get the same thing. So, I don't know. It's kind of disturbing, and there's a lot of things in the culture these days that I'm not happy with, but that's probably because I'm so old. You know how that is. Anyway.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't call it.
One thing about the atheist side of the camp, and I was looking at some of your content that you have. You're a little bit of a fledgling YouTuber yourself, and
Yeah.
and one piece that I saw that was quite interesting is this kind of reverse nuance, because there's this what I call it, it's a bad argument. There's a lot of what I would consider sophomoric arguments, right? And in that context, like for example, there seems to be this, what you pointed out is science denial coming from
Yeah,
the skeptic camp.
right.
Essentially, whenever a believer like myself, for example, tries to make an argument that we can use what we know about science to help us point towards a creator, right?
Yeah,
And in
absolutely,
that sense that,
absolutely.
when we try to make the correlation that DNA is a code, which you've gone in
Right.
quite detail about, it's in your field of expertise. And I loved how you kind of just, you know, you just kind of debunk that pretty quickly, like, hey bro, even science textbooks will tell you that DNA is a code. This is accepted by actual biologists. So for a layman to kind of say, oh, DNA is not really a code, we just think it's a code, is completely way off base thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, it drives me nuts.
Yeah, I thought that was funny.
I don't know where it originally came from, but it's so crazy. I mean, I don't know any biologists who would ever agree that DNA does not form a real code. The genetic code is a real code. Now, that might change because there are a lot of very militant atheist biologists, and they might decide that this is right and change the name. I mean, there is some science denial even among scientists, although most of these people are not scientists and they don't know anything about biology, for example. So, they don't even get it right. They don't understand what a code and a sequence, what the difference is. So there's a lot of ignorance here, and that's what I'm trying to counteract. But now it's not just in biology. I mean, there are people who have realized that the identification of the origin of the universe from the Big Bang 14 billion years ago is very consistent with the idea that there was a beginning to the universe. In other words, that it was created and nobody knows how. So the idea of a creator God is perfectly feasible. And so what they're now doing is they're coming up with these crazy theories that in fact the universe did not have a beginning. It's past eternal, like we used to think. And there's a couple of atheist physicists like Krauss and a couple of others who are supporting that. But it's not real. I mean, it's the only reason that anyone is coming up with these new ideas is to counter the fact that a lot of what we're learning scientifically about the world is totally consistent with the Bible or totally consistent with Christian belief. So that's crazy. That's why I say that atheism will eventually be forced into a corner of science denialism, because you're going to now, of course, when I say that, they go bananas. They start yelling and screaming, and of course it's not happened yet, but it there's already several examples like that. And as more findings come out that are consistent with the God hypothesis, with the idea that God is the creator, you're going to see more and more atheists screaming, no, that's wrong, and the real science is something else. And when they say the real science, they're making it up.
Well, we're glad to have people like you on the front line, Sy.
Thanks.
The last question that I wanted to ask you is, so you're also an author. I actually just ordered your book,
Okay.
and so I am excited for it to arrive. The book is called The Works of His Hands. So tell the folks what your book is about.
So it has two purposes. Part of it is the story of how I came to faith. In fact, the subtitle is A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. By the way, the foreword is written by Alistair McGrath, an English theologian very well known in this field. And so part of it is the story of my own journey. I talk about my where I started from, and part of it is talks about the science that led me to reject the idea of materialism and and reject my rejection of spirituality. And so there's a little physics, there's a little bit of biochemistry in it, some biology. I talk about origins. I talk about the origin of the universe, the origin of life and human consciousness. I have a chapter that is devoted to the things that actually brought me to faith. So that's a number of stories and dreams. I have some fables in there with inject a certain amount of humor. I thought that might be objectionable to some folks, but everybody seems to like it. And that's about it. So it's basically a chronicle of my own experiences with a lot of science put in, but nothing is, I've only gotten, I think, one comment saying the science was too hard. Usually, most people don't have any trouble, and if they do, I think I even said it in the book, just skip that part, it doesn't matter. So, I talk about some of the things that I think make it clear that science and Christianity are certainly compatible.
Amazing. Well, that should get here tomorrow for me, so I am super excited about getting the book. I am going to read it straight away.
Okay.
And for everybody else, if you guys want to check out more about Sy Garte, he's got a website, sygarte.com. You can also find him on Twitter. And Sy, I'm just so happy that you took the time for us today. Thank you so much for coming on. God bless you.
God bless you for all the work you're doing. Bye-bye.